Hello and welcome back to this damnful idealistic crusade. This is the next video in my series of rereading the classic Hardy Boys canon of books and also doing a back-to-back comparison read of the original text of the first 38 books with its more common and currently still in print revised text. For those who haven't seen my previous videos or who have never heard of this, the Stratemeyer Syndicate, who was behind the Hardy Boys and Nancy Drew and most of the iconic various book series, particularly for the Hardy Boys and Nancy Drew, in 1959, they started a revision process that was ostensibly to remove dated elements and some occasional bits of racial stereotyping, amongst other things, but also as a means of streamlining the books and cutting down on the page count, which of course meant they were cheaper to print and manufacture, and it was all to sort of keep them in line with the new sort of standards they had by the volumes in 1959. And these revisions were done by a variety of authors over an extended period of many years, and they were also done out of order. But the only way you'd know that there were changes made is if you had two copies of the same book with the same title, usually with different cover artwork by this point. And you'd notice that the newer book was usually much slimmer in terms of usually anywhere between 20 and 40 pages less, and would feature a usually revised storyline or a heavily revised storyline, or sometimes virtually no connection to the original book outside of maybe a name or small plot element. So there's different types of revisions, and there's also different degrees of revisions. And the only way you're going to be able to really get this knowledge firsthand is if you do a back-to-back comparison read of the two different texts. And again, because they were done sort of out of order over a long period of time by a bunch of different authors, the tones vary, and so it's quite interesting that this happened, and the way it was done and implemented means that it's at least I think it's quite unique in terms of literary history and also literary revisionism. And again, the same thing happened to the Nancy Drew books at that point in 1959 as well. But usually the first things to go, of course, were the elements specifically linking the books to the 1920s and 1930s, and also elements where the boys were a bit sarcastic to authority figures or didn't always get along with the police, and were much more able to handle themselves on their own and could get into really nasty scrapes, and the sense of danger and peril could be more in the original text, and they basically had a grittier feel. There was a greater sense of world building. There was a greater sense of honestly humor as well. That was tied into this sense that the boys and their friends had more depth to their characterization. And so you can understand the publisher wanting to update the books and remove the sort of fleeting bits of racial stereotyping being the biggest thing that they were targeting. And that's what most things would claim they were doing with the original books. It's like, oh, well, we're taking out all that bad stuff. There wasn't a lot of that to begin with, so it was primarily a means of streamlining the books to fit with what they were doing at the time. And so when you get to book 39 and you read all the revised texts, they do kind of flow into one another, so you can see what they were going for. But it was also to cut down the page count. So it's one of those things where the more you look into it, you can kind of see why they were going for it, but it wasn't because the original books were so completely, woefully out of date. There were out of date elements because we're talking about a series that started in 1927, but it's a topic that I don't think most people are quite aware of, especially if you only read the series growing up, or you never really got heavily into collecting them, or looked at online articles or fan groups and things. So with every one of these videos, I try to give that little disclaimer if you haven't seen one of my previous videos. So it is the first 38 books that had this applied, and so the only way you're going to know for sure what was changed or retained, or how the revision was done for each particular book, is to literally read the two different texts back to back. Now, book 16 is the classic A Figure in Hiding. The original text was from 1937 and written by primary series author Leslie McFarlane, who wrote the majority of the first 26 books, but this is the point where he basically took a break from the series. So after book 16, you have a different author coming in, John Button, who's sort of notorious among fan circles for really kind of going off the rails and taking the series into different areas entirely. So after this point, the next couple books are basically, your results may vary when you're talking about the John Button books, at least in the original text iteration. So that makes this book even more important, as it's sort of the series at a crossroads, because McFarlane had written the books up to this point and then would come back for a few more volumes, and then that was kind of it. And his writing voice really is the heart and soul of the Hardy Boys and all of these books and what the Hardy Boys are all about. And he was a brilliant writer. And so when he was no longer there, you had to sort of try and live up to or match that in terms of being the ghostwriter of that book, because famously all the books were ghostwritten under the Franklin W. Dixon moniker. So as kids, we didn't know any of this, but when you read a McFarlane written text, you can tell it's one of his, because his writing voice is so strong and so detailed and so present that it makes the books feel more real. And again, that sense of world building is all throughout them. The revised text was done in 1965 by James Lawrence, and for the era of, I think, the best sort of revisions in the revised text, it does seem to be kind of concentrated around I'd say probably the mid 1960s, because most of the revised texts so far that I thought were really exceptional, or really took what they were given and also kept the core of the original book, or improved on some things enough to make it stand on its own. It seems like most of those are kind of concentrated around the mid 1960s. Now, this is a situation, I think, that's very much like what I talked about in my last video on book 15, The Sinister Signpost, where you have the original text written by the primary series original author. It's got all of the pluses of his beautiful writing style, his sense of world building, with a little dash of more of a feel of pulpy action, because the original text Hardy Boys books that McFarlane wrote did at times have all the wonderful elements that you expect from an adventure or detective story that you would read in, say, a pulp magazine in the 1930s, which doesn't necessarily translate into the revised text, because they had a different mentality. They would have a lot more action, but they wouldn't have that sort of pulpy energy to them. But as I said about Sinister Signpost, the plot of the original text kind of meanders around and doesn't necessarily make a whole lot of sense. And then by the end, it suddenly goes to a over-the-top level in terms of intensity that kind of feels like it's coming out of left field. And I kind of questioned if maybe McFarlane was sort of getting a little bit burned out, maybe, because that was the 15th book, and also because he would be given an outline basically to then write the book. He was basically commissioned to write each book by the syndicate. There had been different people doing the outlines, and they had kind of changed, and so depending on who was writing the outline, that sort of, I think, could push the book in a different way. And so starting with that book and then going through this one and then the next couple that were written by John Button that really go off the deep end, I think this is an interesting sort of era where, again, the series is at a crossroads, and I think it's also due to some of the outlines the writers were being given. But here in A Figure in Hiding, there's a lot of great elements. There's a lot of there's actually several different interesting plot hooks, but it doesn't really feel as if it congeals in terms of the plot, which again is the issue I had with the original text of Sinister Signpost. And again, the revised text, while it's usually said to be completely different, it does retain certain elements, certain characters and names. So you have the same sort of character type, just you sort of rendered it a little differently with the same name. And there's a central sort of gang referred to as an eye gang, or having something to do with eyes. And there is a literal figure in hiding, so you do get the meaning of the title. But just like Sinister Signpost, the revised text here does add so many unique, interesting additional subplots and other plot elements that build on the sort of core nuggets of ideas they take from the original text, that it does feel more varied and it does feel more developed, ironically, even with a shorter page count. And in spite of having so many other plot elements going on, I think it actually feels more unified, and you can actually, when you finish it, you could actually give, I think it'd be easier to give a plot summary of the revised text than it is the original text. And that's kind of funny because the thing is here with the revised text, it's got even more additional elements and subplots and things going on than the revised text of Sinister Signpost did. And it doesn't exactly maintain the identical core idea of the original text, like at least some of Sinister Signpost did. So this is a revised text that is keeping some characters and some archetypes and some names, but it's also transforming them and moving them around in different areas and basically throwing them in the soup kettle with all this other stuff they've done in terms of different subplots. So the plot of the original text is essentially revolving around Frank and Joe Hardy being brought into a case with their father, Fenton Hardy, who's trying to nail a gang of essentially medical grifters who are going around taking advantage of people, led by a Dr. Grafton, who is a quack doctor and basically goes to people promising them that he can cure their bad eyesight and stuff, and basically rips them off and absconds with their money, and sometimes carries out, quasi operations of sorts that could be, of course, very dangerous. So the boys and their father start by essentially performing hotel surveillance on the two gang associates of the villainous Dr. Grafton, with the fun names of Spotty Lemuel and Rip Cinder, essentially, which is fun. But then what seems kind of straightforward gets a little bit convoluted, because there's essentially one of those characters has an estranged daughter who sort of is upset that her father is obviously a criminal, and then the boys continually run into her at various intervals, and that sort of takes the plot in a different direction, and it doesn't ever kind of get fleshed out or developed. So that seems almost like a sort of plot detour. Again, just like in Sinister Signpost, at least for me, I got the sense of there's kind of a feeling of the plot meandering. It actually takes a little while for us to get the full story of why Fenton Hardy is after these people and this gang, and basically the boys at the opening of the book kind of just run into their dad doing surveillance, and then they get the adjoining hotel room, and then it just kind of starts from there. But the benefit of the original text is you've got McFarlane writing. The boys' characterizations are beautifully done, of course. The sense of world building is there. There's some pulpy grittiness. There's some things the boys do that are a little bit getting into gray areas, and it does build to like the last book, a quite dramatic conclusion that does ramp up the tension, because the ending of the original text has the boys being buried alive. So that's not something you see in a kid's book very often. And that's certainly a sequence with a level of intensity that you're not quite going to get in the revised text. But the journey to even get to that point in the last act, there's a lot of sort of back and forth. You kind of start to wonder why we're kind of going back and forth so much in terms of travel, and why certain characters are not quite so developed. And then there's also a particular quirk in this book where there's not one but two sort of long lost children that are mentioned by particular side characters, and it just so happens that both of them turn out to be characters that are in this book. And as soon as the sort of long lost a child character is mentioned, it's kind of dead obvious who that's going to turn out to be and why this is being done. One, maybe you could argue is okay, I can see that, but two characters and two different side characters saying that they had a long lost child of sorts, or a child who just kind of went off on their own way and was never any good, and that's stretching coincidence way too far. So that was another thing that and I remember the last time I read the original text, it that also bothered me, because it was just like, okay, I could understand maybe one, but two, and then the second one, it's just kind of, why is this here? It's not developed. And it just so happened that the Hardy Boys were talking with this other side character who's barely in the book, who just so happened to be one of the potential victims of Dr. Grafton, and just so happened to say she had a long lost child she had always tried to find. And there's a character in the book who just so happens to find out that they were actually an orphan, and then doesn't know where they came from. It's just like, really? So yeah, there's two characters that sort of have that scenario in this one book, and that's just that's a bit too much, really. Now, to contrast all of that with the revised text, which does at the very least keep, again, as I said, at least a few events from the book. In particular, there's a robbery at the local movie theater. The box office gets robbed while the Hardy Boys are there, and they chase after the thief. So, as in all of these so far, even when it's supposedly a completely different work, you can recognize certain elements, whether it's a name, a sort of plot hook, or even sequences sometimes. Even if they're rendered differently, it is clearly still the same sequence. But the revised text does have a gang with a eye motif. It's actually the Evil Eye Gang, and it's known as the Eyes Syndicate. So it's the boys and their father trying to take down an entire crime syndicate. So the scale is much bigger. We do have some of the same character names turn up in terms of Spotty the Mule or Dr. Grafton, but they are essentially different characters performing some of the same functions. There's also new characters because there's new subplots. So we have the boys and their father. The boys are first mysteriously warned by a peddler informant of their father's that there's essentially an eye gang and to look out for them. And then there's also even the fascinating usage of a glass eye that's discovered, that the boys don't know what the significance of that is, but for whatever reason, various individuals seem to want to get that back at any cost, of course. That's another interesting mystery subplot that eventually gets revealed by the end of the book. In terms of the other subplots, we have the Jeweled Siva, which is a priceless archaeological artifact that has been stolen that the boys also have to try and recover in this book. There is an acquaintance of theirs with a hydrofoil that he's trying to test and find financial backing for that gets involved in the mystery and even gets hijacked at one point. There's a health farm on the outskirts of town where the boys amusingly run into essentially an elderly stockbroker who has to basically continually break out of there because he doesn't like that he's been sent there, and their chum Chet Morton gets a job there, and that's the sort of what is Chet's hobby, because he always has to have one in the revised text especially, and here it's of course that their food-loving chum decides he's going to get a job at a health farm and then have to lead exercise routines and things. So he basically makes himself miserable. But also, eventually, the said health farm goes into another subplot because that health farm may not be all what it seems. And by the final act, the question then becomes, is it just a health farm, or is it also somehow tied to the gang? And could it also be potentially a sort of criminal's paradise to sort of hide out and potentially establish a new identity? And then there's even another subplot with a businessman in another town who owns a car dealership and is in seemingly financial straits, and also being continually harassed by members of the I Gang. So already, just off the top of my head, you've got at least 4 or 5, if not 6 different subplots. All of them are actually, even though it sounds like a lot and they sound completely unrelated, the revised text does a brilliant job of actually bringing all those elements together with what it took from the original text, and also sort of transforming some of those original characters. It all works, and it actually has a consistent plot, and it actually keeps some of the same events and some of the same characters from the original text, but sort of turns them on their head a little bit, or mixes it up a little. So instead of the boys going to, say, for example, the woman in the original text and trying to warn her about Dr. Grafton's schemes, that he's not actually able to cure her eyesight, and then her saying, oh yes, I also have a long lost child I've been looking for 20 years, kind of out of nowhere. here they go to the woman who's actually the one who had the jeweled Siva, and it was actually her husband who was an archaeologist, and he had finally died, and so she had to put it up for sale. And so there's actually interesting bits where the revised text takes certain pieces of the original text and actually manages to keep them, but weaves it into what they're doing with all these other plot elements. So I have to say, this is another case where, like Sinister Signpost, it doesn't have the sort of final act intensity of the original text, and it doesn't ever get that sort of pulpy action flavor of where you really feel like the boys could die in the hairier moments, or where they're really having to use that sort of two-fisted quality of a pulp action story of really having a sense of grittiness and shades of gray, and having to sort of fight to uncover the truth and things. But you do get continually more action throughout the revised text, and you get so much more development in terms of all the other plots and subplots going on, and there's so much more in terms of side characters that are more developed, and it never feels like it's a plot that's meandering. So I think this is like Sinister Signpost, where I do think the revised text actually wins out overall as the more satisfying book. It wasn't allowed the luxuries of the original text in terms of McFarlane being able to write in his style and write at his own pace and not have to worry about, I can only have it be, 170 pages, somewhere around there, instead of more like 210 or 220. So the revised text, you always have to keep in mind that the authors had even more constraints put on them, and they had to make sure it fit in with the new sort of series tone that was going on in the other books that were then current in the 50s and 60s. So it's not exactly a fair comparison, but it is fascinating to look at a book like this, even when it's supposedly one of the ones that's completely different, and notice the parallels and what they took and what they kept and what they sort of mashed around with the new elements. And so you've at least got reflections and echoes. And yes, there's a quack doctor named Dr. Grafton in the revised text, but again, there's just so much more going on in the revised text. There's so much more for all our characters to do and go through. There's not some elements that feel more like side quests that don't go anywhere, which is, I think, an issue in the original text. The revised text doesn't really meander. It doesn't have the time to, because it has less pages, and it's got so many more plot elements and subplots going on. It has far more action beats. It's got even more sort of chapter cliffhangers where it looks like the boys aren't going to make it. And I think the ending is actually a lot more satisfying with the whole sort of denouement at the health farm and the setup of it. And I think there's also a clearer connection between the sides of the case that the boys and their father are working on. And as in most of the classic series, you have a sort of meeting of the two halves where we've been following the boys the whole time, and at the end Fenton Hardy sort of comes in with his side, and either they realize they've been working on the same case the whole time, or they've sort of joined forces by the end. But I do think the ending of the revised text is significantly more developed and satisfying, and does fit the overall plot threads. It caps it off perfectly, whereas the original text has a really dramatic end, but it doesn't feel as effective because there's been so much meandering to get to that point, and then it gets really dramatic, but it's kind of out of left field a little bit, because we go from kind of okay, and then suddenly the knob gets turned up to 11, and then it just kind of stops there, because then it doesn't, even that doesn't feel like it gets as fully resolved as it could have been. But then again, that's at the very end of the book, so there's not many pages to play around with. So as much as I can go on and on about how I do think the original text is better written in terms of looking at the actual prose and the writing style, and the sense of the original text being a little bit more realistic in terms of having the feeling of shades of gray and characters being a bit more three-dimensional, because the plot is kind of inconsistent, and some elements I think aren't developed so much. It does have, I think, a lot of the same issues that Sinister Signpost did in its original text. And again, that's nothing to do with McFarlane's writing, because you do have to keep in mind he's having to write from outlines he was given, just like the revised text authors are having to write a version of the original text with all these rules and stipulations, and also I'm sure a slate or a version of an outline they're given. So none of the authors got to basically sit down and write normally or naturally. They all had some sort of constraint. So you do have to keep that stuff in mind. And again, this is my own personal opinion. I know there are fans out there who do prefer the original text of book 16 to the revised text, but for me, and reading them back to back, I do think the revised text has so much more going on and is more tightly plotted in spite of that, and it feels so much more coherent, and that the final act is much more satisfying because of that plot coherence, that I do think it manages to be the better of the two. Again, it basically follows with my feelings on Sinister Signpost. So this also being the last book McFarlane would write for a while, I think is important, because whether it was writer's fatigue after having to do 16 books, or whether it was just the outline tones sort of changing, or the publisher trying some different elements, or I think it's probably a little bit of both of those. And so I think you can tell that in 15 and 16 there's a little bit of a shift going on, because I think they do feel just a little bit different than the books that preceded them. They've kind of been building to this point, and I do think that in these two, in the original text, there's a greater sense of the plot kind of meandering and not feeling as quite as fulfilling as they could have been. But that's, again, I think, going back to the outlines that were first prepared. But I'm always really surprised when I reread the revised text, because it adds so much. There's I just even trying to list through and like a bullet point list of all the different subplots and things, and that's not even getting into the fact that Fenton Hardy's associate Sam Radley's in this book, and all the other bits of business the revised text has. So it moves with a super quick pace, like all the revised books do, but it's just got so much more going on that in its own way, it's kind of an unfair comparison to the original text, because it's got so much more material and so much more going on and so much new stuff and subplots and new characters and action beats and sequences, that compared to the original text, in comparison, while it's got the better writing and the better sense of dimensionalized characters and the richer humor and stuff, it can't compete with all the stuff that's going on in the revised text. So for me, this is another case where I think the revised text is actually the better book. They're still both great classic reads, and I think this is something any fan of the series should do. Or if any of this sounds remotely interesting and you're not a fan of the series, and if so, thank you for clicking on this video. I think this is one case where you're going to very much see which style you prefer in terms of reading these back to back. And again, every fan's opinion is going to be different, what sort of you gravitate towards more. But there's just so much more in the revised text that I think that alone kind of makes it pull ahead. But again, that ending being so much more developed and having so many more elements and all the different plot threads coming together and actually making sense and fitting, and that ending in the revised text is so much more satisfying, really. So I think that sort of seals the deal in terms of when you're comparing the two, at least in my opinion. Now to talk about the cover art, like I like to do in these videos. This time we only have two to discuss, and they're basically they're two versions of the same image that do come from the end of the book. So this is another example of where, even though the revised text is dramatically, if not entirely different, it does retain one of the iconic images of the book, so that way it could actually have the same image as its cover. So even when a revised text is supposedly completely different or changes most everything, there's usually enough echoes or sequences or names or things carried over. And I think this is a good example of that. So in the original cover from 1937, which was done by Paul Lon or Lonnie, I'm not sure how you pronounce it, but this is sort of in keeping with what I've mentioned in the past couple books of the first cover having that sort of 1930s pulp magazine feel in terms of the staging and having a little ominous quality to it. This one with the tree does harken back to the original cover of Sinister Signpost, and we have the sort of slightly stylized Hardy Boys logo and font that fits with that book as well. It does seem that once you hit the books 11 through 20 or so, they tried different elements with the cover and the typeface and the fonts they were using, and switching up the artist, and all of them seem to have at least some flavor of a 1930s pulp magazine. But this one has also a nice sort of subdued quality because the night background, it's a little similar to, I guess, some of the What Happened at Midnight covers being set at night, and it's obviously one of the boys spying upon a figure inside the window of a house. And also because he's out on a tree branch, he could be spotted at any time, or the tree branch could break or something. So there's that sense of danger and that ominous feeling, and it does draw the eye. But I have to say the second cover by John Leone, which was done in 1962, so that means this was used for the original text and the last couple editions it had. It's reworking the same idea as most of the sort of second covers will do with the Hardy Boys stories, but it has a more striking composition. It's not having the tree as close to the window, but it's also the staging is so much clearer, and we also have the light hitting the face coming out of the window. We've also got figures down on the ground, so it seems like there's more stuff going on, and it seems like the actual character is going to get spotted much more quickly. And it looks like it's supposed to be Frank in both of these covers, but we've also got the broken window in the second cover, which doesn't really seem to be in the first cover, although the tree kind of obscures the window. But there is an actual window that gets broken in this sequence, so I've always loved that was actually reflected in the cover. But there's also the nice sort of, it's still set at night, but the sky is sort of greenish. It's like a greenish blue, which gives it a particularly interesting and eye-catching quality to it. Frank's wearing an orange sweater, and he's got what looks like, I guess, khakis on. So there's actual color in his clothing that is sort of subdued, but also eye-catching. And I think it's overall just a much more pleasing image in terms of attention grabbing, in terms of color, in terms of composition and staging, and because there's a little bit more stuff going on, and the broken window, it makes it look like he's going to be discovered at any moment. So I think it actually increases the sort of feeling of danger. And you've got the figure in hiding title in white, dead center at the top, so it's kind of more attention grabbing with the yellow Hardy Boys logo of the time period. And then this will get reused on all the editions since. And because the revised text replicated this scene in the finale in terms of, one of the boys up in a tree and looking in the second story window that was broken, they could use this cover. And I think it fits both books perfectly. But as it's a 1962 painting and the clothing styles and the hairstyle and stuff, it does seem more tied to the revised text. But they were still able to use this for the original text as well. Now let's talk about the editions in my collection. I just have 3. For my original text copy, I just have one of the iconic Tweed editions. This, of course, is without the original dust jacket, but Tweed editions usually refer to any variety of the iconic brown hardcovers with the traditional style and the iconic Hardy Boys logo from this time period, and the sort of cross-stitch tweed appearance of the brown. There are, of course, different varieties of these as they were printed for a long time, but whenever you don't have the dust jacket, it's a lot harder to try and determine the actual vintage of the book. This does have the brown and white end papers, which does mean that it's probably from around the mid to late 1950s, if not the early 60s. It does retain the updated front piece artwork, and that's also very nicely printed. So that was at least retained in the Tweed editions. And of course, here is the original copyright page with the 1937 date and the chapter listing. And as you can see, the book does go over 200 pages, which is usually your biggest sign that you've got an original text if you're confused about what version you're looking at. The other thing is always that the original texts have the unique text style and layout and bigger margins. So if you notice things like font, you can usually tell pretty easily that it's the original text style versus what you see in the revised text, which have their own. My copy of the revised text that I've had since I was a kid is this edition, which has the blue bar that was implemented in the mid to late 1970s. So this otherwise has the traditional picture cover style, but also on the back, being a later 1970s copy, you can see this is a transition period because we've got the older style of the blurb on the back on the top, but here on the bottom they had already switched the printed book list to the more bold Helvetica font, and that's usually the biggest indicator that you've got a copy from the 70s. Eventually they would also change the top half and make it more bold and make it stand out more, usually with a sort of a box around it and also with the Helvetica font. And then they also had started adding the blue bars on the top. They would do the same thing for Nancy Drew and add a yellow bar on the top. First, it was just adding the number, then it was turning this blue, and eventually that would transition over into the flashlight edition in the 90s primarily. So this is the sort of first iteration of that. That, of course, means that the artwork is sort of cropped and moved around. So again, this is basically the first version of the flashlight sort of concept. But this is a really good printing. The art has really bold color, and it's held up really, really well. So that's something I've always noticed with this. And of course, the artwork quality and color saturation and everything will vary wildly in terms of when it was made or how it was printed, and different runs were better than others. There's always variation when it's just so many books being reprinted over and over. On the inside, we have the black and white end papers, the sort of multi-scene end papers that were what came after and replaced the brown and white ones. And because this lists to the Mysterious Caravan on the back, that would date this particular printing to about 1975, which is when Mysterious Caravan came out. And if I needed anything, any further clue, there's an inscription on the front, as most of the books you find used will usually have one. And this was given as a Christmas gift in 1976. So I always love seeing those, but it's really cool when they have the date on there, so you get a sort of confirmation of when it was printed. So here we have the title page and then the front piece artwork. Of course, the revised texts have their own artwork and do have wonderful illustrations throughout. Here is the revised copyright page for 1965, and of course, the new chapter listing, which, as you can see by the page count, is significantly shorter because the last chapter starts on page 165 instead of 204. And then we have the revised text style of text and text layout. Then for the internal illustrations, we start with this lovely 2-page spread of the speeding hydrofoil. Then a scene of Frank being waylaid by the would-be thief from the theater robbery. The boys sort of breaking into the estate of the car dealership owner and then being set upon by the entire pack of guard dogs ready to rip their throats out. Another 2-page spread of airport surveillance gone wrong. Here we have Chet Morton, wonderfully illustrated, not having the most fun time at his new job. And that does it for my childhood copy of the revised text. But I also have the common flashlight edition, which is the version you'll pick up today, or if you purchase the book new, it's going to be this edition, of course. And as I've said before, the artwork can vary wildly in quality. This is definitely one where you can see how the contrast and the color saturation is extraordinarily different at times. So this flashlight copy has the appearance of being sort of washed out looking, but it's still got a nice amount of detail. It just doesn't compare to this 1970s copy, and of course wouldn't compare to an original 1962 picture cover in great condition. But this right here just shows you the difference between a nicely done 70s copy, even with the blue bar on the top, and then the flashlight text being sort of more, it just has that lighter look to it. But again, the printing is still good otherwise. And if I can line these up, you can see that the actual dimensions are a little bit different. So there's actually more cropping on the 70s edition, but it's also, again, the rendering is so much better. But then there's still cropping on the flashlight edition. So you do have to deal with varying degrees of that depending on just how well the book was printed, because again, even the flashlight copies have variations in terms of some were better made than others. And I say that a lot in these videos because the more that I look at the books in bookstores and just copies I come across, you'll note that the flashlight editions, usually about 2005 or so in terms of the manufacture date, just feel a little bit sloppier compared to earlier ones, and the covers won't be printed as well, and they don't feel as sturdy. So again, if you're into the flashlight editions or you want solid copies, it's best to look for copies from the 90s or the early 2000s really. So here's the updated copyright page. This is a 2000 printing, and like all of the flashlights, it has the really nice, clean, very bright white paper. So if having the sort of slightly aged feel of a 70s printing bothers you or something you look for, that's something that is, of course, unique to older printings versus the flashlights. But, of course, everything else is the exact same in terms of the layout and design. It is the revised text. It just has the updated front information and then a modernized order form for the books for ordering in the year 2000. And then the rear has the standardized rear cover as all the flashlights do. So they all have the same standardized rear cover that we're used to with these. And of course, the matching spine as well. So all in all, I think A Figure in Hiding is still a classic in the series. I mean, there's no book in the original canon, which is what we refer to the original 58 books as in terms of the overall well, that's basically going under the revision text under Grosson and Dunlap. But out of the 58, there's not a bad book. And then the original text of the first 38 books, there's, well, you have to count the John Button books being completely out there and different. But even those have charms of their own, so there's not really a bad book in those. So to summarize, I think A Figure in Hiding remains a classic in either text, and it will be basically up to the individual reader or fan. If you're doing a comparison, depending on your taste or what you look for in a Hardy Boys story, I think that will determine which you prefer. Each represents the positives of the original text and then the revision text process and the actual methods those were developed in. But I do think the original text does have some of the same shortcomings of the original text of the book that preceded it, Sinister Signpost. And I think there was probably a reason why Leslie McFarlane took a break after this book. So again, this is the point at which when you're reading the original text, you basically kind of have to, in your mind, put the series on pause, because the next couple books in the original text are the John Button era, and if you've not heard of those or haven't read those, they have a particular connotation within the fan community as being the ostensibly the worst of the original texts, or the ones that are the most out, just out of the comfort zone or out of character for the series essentially, and they're quite wild. So the next three videos at least are going to be interesting, and those are examples where the revised text very much greatly change, if not do away with entirely the original text that they were redoing. So the sort of John Button era of the original text is where you get some real eye openers in terms of books. So it's fascinating to see how suddenly when you have the original author go away, things can get really crazy for a while, and then he comes back. So sort of like to get things on track essentially. But anyway, I just think A Figure in Hiding is very much a similar scenario to the Sinister Signpost, in that the revised text has so many new and interesting and unique elements that are added to sort of transmogrified and transformed elements of the original text, so that it at least still feels like the original text in some form, and you can recognize elements and there are echoes of the original text. But I think in spite of adding so much new material, it manages to be a more consistent plot, and by the ending it, I think, has a more satisfying conclusion because all those threads are nicely woven together and every one of them is paid off. Whereas the original text, I just think there's a bit too many coincidences and the plot does meander, and I kind of wish it had some of the stuff that was in the revised text, especially the health farm stuff. Yeah, and the original text is still good. And again, it has McFarlane's great prose, and I do think McFarlane was a truly great writer and doesn't get the credit for it. There's a reason why the original Hardy Boys books became so famous and so popular and so iconic and have lasted for generations. So they still need to be preserved and read. You definitely know you're reading great prose when you read those. They feel so vivid in the mind's eye and the reader's eye, from the characters to the world building and such. And you get that sort of 1930s pulp magazine flavor of having a little bit of danger and spice to the proceedings, and the boys having two-fisted moments, and there's some grit there, which is really nice, but it's just not as fully realized as I wish it was. And again, I felt the same way about the Sinister Signpost. So I think because these are back to back, it's kind of like it's following the same sort of trends, and it's we're at this point of the book series where, again, this would be the point at which the original author is going to step away for a while. So I think that definitely somehow plays into this. So that and the changes in the sort of outlines, I think it was probably good for a time to sort of step away and recharge one's batteries. But any of the sort of quirks or issues I have with the original texts of 15 and 16, oh, that's nothing compared to what's coming. So again, my next couple videos will have to be talking about the original text written by John Button, and they go off the deep end, literally. I mean, in the next book, there's literally lots of deep water scenes and such, but the next three books especially are, two of them are okay. They have issues of their own, but one in particular, the original text of Disappearing Floor, book 19, is the most bizarre and out there and wacky original text Hardy Boys book, and easily the one wacky book in the entirety of the original canon. And that book is probably the only one that most people would probably label as being quote unquote bad. It's an experience. I've read it before, and some people love it, but it is the most out there, and that's what the first two John Button books kind of build to. So again, there's a reason why this is a sort of interesting transition point, and it's important to note that because the next three books in the original text, they're really out there. So again, any issues I may have with the original text of A Figure in Hiding are nothing compared to what's coming. So do keep that in mind as well. So as always, I hope my babblings about the classic Hardy Boys series have been at least somewhat fun and informative. I hope I can encourage fans to try a comparison read of the two texts of the first 38 books. If you've never done so before, it is the perfect way to make the rereading process fresh again. It's also a fascinating thing to do in terms of literary studies because, as I said before, this is really a unique sort of moment in literature and publishing, because here you have a publisher just completely reworking an entire series of books up to the point at which they started this in 1959, wholesale, with different authors over a long period of time, out of order, with varying degrees of faithfulness to the original text they were reworking, and not crediting anyone or announcing they were doing this or anything, just going ahead and doing it. So there's nothing else quite like this for the Hardy Boys and Nancy Drew in terms of publishing, really, that I'm aware of for this level of just completely rewriting books from scratch, or just basically taking pieces of the original text and moving everything around and just trying to turn it into a completely different work under the same title. So it's actually something that I think is beneficial and enlightening to anyone who just wants to look into literary revisionism, or how some books or works have been changed over time. Because again, I can't think of anything else as extensive as this process was for both series, of course. So again, it's kind of unique, and it's really an eye-opener, and it also really makes you think about the adaptation process. So I also think it's helpful for people trying to improve their writing skills or their adaptation skills to look at what the revised texts do and what they keep and what they sort of take little pieces of, and you see it pop up in the revised text, and you have to think back and you go, oh, well, that's actually like this character here. They just tweaked the name, and then you can see all the elements sort of start to come back to the surface, even if the plot may be entirely different. So as always, please do keep supporting your local independent bookstores by hopefully being able to pick up some beautiful Hardy Boys editions. Please keep enjoying the classic Hardy Boys canon. It is one of the great treasures of American literature and pop culture. And I will be back soon with my video on book 17 in both texts of The Secret Warning. So definitely keep reading print books. And as always, thank you ever so much for watching.